Thank you all so much for coming. I'm Anya. I'm really so honored to be associated with Maker Faire and to be invited here. And I really appreciate as much attention as you can manage to give me at 4 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon. It's totally appreciated because this is, in fact, my first official public book talk for my next book, which is called The Test. And it is, thanks, guys. I'm really pleased to be following the guy from MIT because there's a lot of dovetail going on. Because when we talk about how education has to evolve, needs to evolve, is evolving, it's all about how we evaluate it. It's all about the feedback. Because in fact, we do manage what we measure, as the cliche goes. And so I'm going to talk about the kinds of tests that currently dominate our schools, many problems that they cause, the reasons that they cause those problems, and critically what we could do about it, what better tests might look like. So what do we mean by the tests? Since the passage of No Child Left Behind in 2001, our schools and our students nationwide have been held accountable for the scores on weak, limited, standardized, high stakes, standalone measures of math and reading only that are multiple choice, machine gradable, produced by a small number of for-profit companies, and error prone, easily gameable, easy to be cheated on, and have a number of other mechanical problems. And it's all of these things together that really cause the issue. I mean, if we had standardized tests but we didn't hang too much on the results of them, they could be a useful tool in our toolbox. If we had standalone measures, then they were absolutely the most gold standard measures that we possibly could have of learning, that it would make sense to tie a lot of stakes to them and hold people to high standards. There's no reason to only test math and reading, because we all know that that's not the only things that people need to learn, but that's what we do. Here are a couple of people who are harmed by standardized testing, and they're not the only ones. They're very representative in different ways. Ethan Redisky was an 8-year-old boy with multiple severe disabilities, about the cognitive development level of a 6-month-old. And because of his status, he received services from the Florida public schools. So he had a special education teacher. He wasn't able to go to school, but he had a special education teacher visit him at home for a few hours a week. Because he was technically in the system as a special ed student, he was required by law, his teachers were required by law to administer him the Florida state standardized tests, a special needs version of that test. However, the most that Ethan could really do in terms of communication was to nod or indicate yes or no by left or right. And so the administering these tests took at least 3 weeks of sessions, of hour-long or sometimes 2-hour-long sessions, as long as he could sit up in his wheelchair, to nod or indicate one or the other until he'd answered enough questions to be scored on the test. If he didn't do that, his teachers would be held accountable for this, and the school would be held accountable for this. This agitated him. It caused pressures, bed sores, pressure sores. It caused respiratory problems. He got fluid in his lungs. He got a lot of anxiety. And his parents had to file. The 3rd grade test came. They gave them. The next year they gave the 4th grade test. They filed for a waiver and said, this is ridiculous. It had to go all the way up to, I don't know what level in the state legislature, until they finally got a 1-year waiver. They had to go back and apply again the next year. And when they were in the midst of applying for it for 6th grade, Ethan unfortunately passed away. Layla Gray is a little bit of a less upsetting case. She was a 3rd grader. She is a 4th grader now. She passed. She was the best student in her family of 5. Loved to read, but she failed the FCAT in 3rd grade, the Florida State again standardized test, by a single point. And this is a test that is used as a promotion guide. So you cannot promote a kid into the next grade unless they pass this test in Florida. They're not transitioning into the Common Core tests, but it's still the same very high stakes deal. And so even though she was a wonderful student, an A student every other way, she was going to be held back a grade while her twin brother went on to the next grade. And her case got referred to a guy who's sort of a state activist around testing. He brought her to Bob Alexander, who's known as the Wizard of Test Prep, he sat with her for 2 hours of tutoring, and she flipped her score and scored completely off the charts the next time they gave her the test, and she was able to enter the 4th grade with the rest of her class. It was really an issue where she overthought things. She read really well, and she always thought, well, this could be true or this could be true, and he basically taught her how to take the test. Wald Haney, who is a longtime expert witness in cases where tests are being seen as discriminatory in civil rights lawsuits, has said that the Florida state tests are among the worst in the country because they are an inappropriate combination of 2 kinds of testing, a norm reference test and a criterion reference test. There's technicalities involved in that, but basically, this test was designed to measure the progress of a population and not to measure the progress of an individual student, and yet that's exactly how it's being applied. And this is a basic error that's being applied with standardized tests all over the country when they're used to decide whether someone should go from one grade into the next. Jackson Ellis is a young boy who lives in Mandeville, Louisiana, and he has sort of multi-spectrum disorders along autism spectrum lines, but also other developmental delays. He scores in about the 2nd percentile on most standardized tests. But his mother fights really hard for him to have inclusion in public school, and because he makes a lot of progress. Now in the 4th grade, you know, the kinds of progress that he makes is a lot around social skills, being able to be in the room with people, to interact with children his age, to make friends. And his mother was told that the teachers would have to take time away from working on these non-cognitive skills, which they all agreed were the most important things for him and the only places where he was really making progress, in order to focus on the math and the reading, where he was making no measurable progress. And she felt like this was a real disservice to what the school could offer him and the kinds of progress he was actually able to make and was making that were really important to his success. Roger Avalos was one of the desaparecidos in the El Paso Independent School District. Lorenzo Garcia, the superintendent, so Texas Miracle was the original template for No Child Left Behind in the late 90s. This idea of having mandatory tests and holding every school accountable for the results of these tests. George W. Bush ran for president very much on the strength of the Texas Miracle in education, where it soon emerged, however, that the Texas Miracle was achieved through a little bit too much smoke and mirrors. So the dropout rates in many Houston high schools were reported at 0. At the same time that independent measures were showing 30% dropout rates. This pattern unfortunately continued even after Bush entered the White House, even after Rod Page, the former Houston superintendent, became Secretary of Education, and they drafted and passed No Child Left Behind, and it became the law of the land. And in the 2000s, Lorenzo Garcia, under the same kind of regime, created this miracle, and it was called the El Paso model, and he showed how tremendously he'd improved his graduation rates, how tremendously he'd improved his test scores in the school district. Lorenzo Garcia is now in federal prison because it emerged the way that he achieved this was through a very nasty set of manipulations, not just falsifying test scores. It's one thing to cheat on the tests, like they did in the Atlanta public schools. No, what Lorenzo Garcia did was he did a series of things designed to stop kids from getting into the 10th grade so that they couldn't be tested. Things like taking Mexican immigrants and incorrectly placing them into the 9th grade, failing as many as half of all Hispanic kids in the 9th grade before they could get to the 10th grade, holding them back a year so they would skip the tested year, the 10th grade being the first tested year. Counseling kids to go get a GED and then saying that they did get a GED, or counseling them to drop out, sending the truant officer around to people's houses to tell them to stay home on the test days because they were thought to be dragging down the scores for the rest of the school. And Avalos was one of the many kids who was essentially in this way squeezed out or very much encouraged to drop out. And there was a guidance counselor who acted as a whistleblower at one of the schools in El Paso that finally helped kind of bring Garcia to justice. But there are so many, many kids in this area who feel that their education was compromised and derailed because of this manipulation of our test scores, which Garcia and many of the people that work for him collected tens of thousands of dollars in bonuses thanks to these test scores manipulations. This is Carolyn Abbott, the Anderson School right here in New York, is an example of what happens when test scores get incorrectly applied to teacher evaluations. So Abbott was a 7th grade math teacher, and value-added teaching, value-added test scores. Do you guys know what value-added evaluations are? All right, so they want to, in most of the states in the country, the federal government has encouraged, if not required, most states to adopt value-added modeling. And the idea is to evaluate teachers based on the test scores of their kids. How do you evaluate teachers based on the test scores of their kids? Well, you can't just give, say that the teachers who have smartest kids are the best teachers, because that seems very absurd. So what they try to do is they try to take the scores one year and compare them with the scores the next year, and they say, how much did these kids improve over this year? How much would you expect them to improve? Therefore, does this teacher produce the expected amount of improvement? Does that make sense? What is the value add of this teacher? Okay, but the model breaks down in many, many, many kinds of ways. It breaks down when you have second graders who didn't take a test. How do you compare that to their performance in 3rd grade? It breaks down when kids enter the school year midway. It breaks down when you have specialist teachers whose subjects have nothing to do with the subjects being tested. It breaks down when kids leave in the middle of the year and then new kids come who haven't had that teacher very long. So the model is incredibly variable. It also breaks down, by the way, when you bring in new tests, like this Common Core state tests, and scores drop across the board. So how do you compare performance one year to the next? However, we're persisting in trying to grade teachers based on these test scores, even though the formulas don't really work. And so Carolyn Abbott was a 7th grade math teacher. Her students did so well on the math test in 7th grade. They were amazing at it. She had the same kids the next year. They were in 8th grade now. They're preparing for the Regents exams. And the math on the 8th grade state test in New York is 3 years behind what they've been studying. And they know that it doesn't count. It doesn't matter for them at all. All they care about is preparing for the Regents. So they slack off. It's the same students that she had the year before, so she keeps the class for 2 years. They slack off. Their scores go down. And according to the value-added model, you would have expected these kids to do the same or better. Instead, they do a little bit worse. Therefore, Carolyn Abbott was counted by the value-added model as the worst math teacher in New York City. And it was published. Her name was published on a list that was FOIA requested and put in the paper. And she quit teaching. She said she went to get a PhD because she said, you can't boil down what a teacher does to a number. So these are some of the problems caused by standardized testing. If you delve a little bit into the well-documented history of psychometrics, it's not too surprising to understand why. Jay Gould talks about this in his classic, The Mismeasure of Man, that the early psychometricians were incredibly innovative and inventive in creating the tools of all social science, the bell curve, regression analysis, vector analysis. They were just so innovative. They made so much great stuff. But they were so obsessed with this idea of G, the G factor, what Charles Spearman called the G factor, which was general intelligence. And they thought that intelligence was a fixed, inherited, and unitary quality in the mind. And they thought that this inheritance was something that was belonged to the white race and to the male gender. And so they basically created psychometrics around this fiction and demonstrated it over and over. And lo and behold, the achievement gaps that we see in today's testing are very much a descendant of many, many years of creating tests and norming them in certain populations and then applying them to other populations and demonstrating what people want to see as a fixed deficit rather than a response to environment or something that could be changed if you change people's circumstances. So there's a lot more about this if you want to get into it. I would like to take questions about that. But the question that remains in front of us now is we have this 19th century technology, the multiple choice, standardized along a bell curve, nationally normed, verified, validated test. And how can we get from that old technology to a technology of assessment that captures the full range of the kinds of beloved, excited, wonderful learning that's going on in places like Maker Faire? I've been taking trips through the future of testing, and some principles for what I think better tests might look like would be that they would measure individualized growth, So a single person's growth, their trajectory along their life. The idea of multiple measures, that you would never have a standalone measure and hang decisions mechanically on the basis of one measure. That you would want to measure a full spectrum of qualities that are important to people's success and not just math and reading. And then the idea of reciprocal accountability is more about the accountability structure that we have around these tests, right? Right now, we're holding schools accountable and students accountable and teachers accountable with these high-stakes tests. But what would happen if we held our communities accountable and our leaders accountable for the inputs that schools get and the support that schools get and that communities get in order to raise and develop the young lives that we're seeking to mold and help. So reciprocal accountability is this idea that you're not just sanctioning and punishing from the top down, but you're also holding people accountable from the bottom up. So better tests, specifically what do they look like? I like to think of them in 4 teams. There's Team Robot, there's Team Monkey, Team Butterfly, and Team Unicorn. Scientific classification. So Team Robot is this idea that we can use technology and big data and analytics to do some kind of invisible stealth testing, stealth assessment. And the idea is, businesses used to stop a few times a year and take stock. They'd have to shut down to count and do inventory. And that's exactly what we do with our schools, right? We spent 25% of the school year, by some measures, doing test prep and testing and retesting and practice testing and benchmark testing and diagnostic testing. And it is just to see how we're doing, we do all of that. So this idea would be if you have kids spend time learning by a computer, the sum total of every question they answer and every hint and everything they get wrong and everything they try would be this very rich measurement in a moment-by-moment increment of how they learn and what they learn over a year. And when they achieve mastery, they don't have to keep working on something. It's learning until you achieve mastery. And so this is the very technocratic, technophilic version or vision of what testing might look like if we didn't have the stop and test, or what they call the drop from the sky test, but we had these sort of little limited ongoing assessments. And one of the neat things about this is when you play a video game, right? Your score for that day is not your final score. You always have a chance to go back and play some more and play again. You can go through the same levels again, or you can start where you left off. And it's never the end. It's always a chance to try again. And so when you have this idea of incremental assessment, there's a lot more fluidity there. There's a lot bigger sense of trajectory of growth rather than, did you learn it on this day in April? Yes or no, pass or fail. There are things not to love so much about Team Robot. People get nervous about big data, analytics, the private ownership of student data, and there are many, many issues to get into there, but this is kind of one vision, right? A second really interesting vision and very pertinent to what we're talking about, what people are experiencing here at Maker Faire, is performance-based assessment. Demonstrations of knowledge, naturalistic demonstrations of knowledge, science fair, right, project-based. You learn it and then you present it and show it. And Charlie Hall is a student at Bate Middle School in Kentucky, at Danville, Kentucky, where his school has switched over to a totally performance-based model. And he made a terrific presentation about his dog Rosie and his dog's heart rate when he fed the dog and how to calm the dog down so it would eat more slowly. Amazing video that he made, really great presentation skills, great skills of giving feedback to other students and sharing feedback. And the whole process of giving, in a performance-based model, students don't just present their work to their teachers, but they present it to community members in that field. And the process of kind of going up in front of a stranger and seeing if you can convince them if you know your stuff is incredibly valuable in itself and really a real-world model of learning and teaching. The other wonderful thing about performance-based assessment, it is totally integrated with teaching and learning. It gives the autonomy back to the teacher and the student to help create what they want to learn and see what they want to learn. The performance assessment schools that I've visited are marked by high levels of joy and engagement and choice. And Charlie really said it all. He was like, look, let's get real. Do you think you're going to be bubbling in answers at your job all day? We're actually learning something that we're going to use here. Performance-based assessment in its current format, the way that it's practiced, is very hard to standardize. It's very hard to compare people's results from one school to the next. In order to use it as the basis of a state accountability model, it would need major retooling and a real big effort to kind of bring teachers into the process of creating and validating these assessments. We can kind of argue about whether that's worth all that you gain by switching to this model. The Team Monkey is what I talk about, assessments of non-cognitive skills. So what we know now is that results on analytic type reading and math tests are about half the story when it comes to who succeeds in school. And the other half of the story is these so-called non-cognitive skills, emotionally based skills, like your self-motivation, your empathy, your communication, your collaboration. People talk about grit, which is basically, do you keep doing what you're doing when it gets hard? And there's a lot of solid, hard economic evidence and also experimental psychological evidence that these qualities are really, really important, but we don't measure them in school, and so we don't pay attention to them, we don't cultivate them, we don't make policy around them, and we don't value the work of people like Jackson Ellis's teachers who work so hard to help him relate to other kids in the schoolyard, which is so, so important for his development and growth, as it is for all of us. So Team Monkey, hundreds of thousands of kids around the country right now are taking low-stakes surveys that ask them questions like, do you feel happy at school? Do you have one best friend? Is there a teacher who cares about you? Are you safe at school? And the results of these surveys are starting to get incorporated into accountability formulas. Not that schools are going to be opened or closed based on these results, but they're going to be factored in when you make personnel decisions or resource decisions. And this stuff gets really solid from a social science perspective when you combine survey data with actual social data from the community, like expulsions, kids out of school, juvenile detention records, crime rates, health, general public health issues, do mothers get prenatal care? When you put all these measures together, you start to look at something like a global happiness score that schools can use to improve their performance in a really strong way. The PISA exam, if you think this is a very floppy and fuzzy, kind of warm and fuzzy way of looking at testing, I would submit to you that the PISA exam, which the OECD gives every other year, every other year, maybe it's, I think it's every other year, to 100 and some countries, it includes a survey that asks the same kinds of emotional questions. And so they think it's important, they think it's important to see how countries relate to each other and measure up against each other. And this is actually a matrix that BuzzFeed published based on the PISA results of the happiest kids and the smartest kids, or the best schools and the happiest kids. And so we're kind of, it's a little bit hard to read this, but you can see us, we're kind of in the top half of the worst quadrant of like below average happiness and below average test scores. So that's Team Monkey. Team Unicorn is a future of testing that may not in fact exist, but it is in development. And the idea here is that we're going to use the best of technology and the best of non-cognitive and performance assessment to create a new kind of hybrid, possibly that would help, that would be able to test higher order skills, the kinds of really 21st century skills that we want our schools to get at, that would be creative, that would allow kids to express themselves, that would be less anxiety producing, that would also be rigorous and produce really hard data that we can use to compare from school to school and student to student. And it would be like so fun to play like a video game, right? So this is, game-based assessment is really in its infancy, but it's taking off. This is a picture of the first game produced by Glass Lab, which is a collaboration amongst many, both testing companies, education companies, and gaming companies to produce, they took the skin, basically, of SimCity and created a lot of small game tasks that have to do with pollution and like real-world simulations of the interplay between like, do you have enough power in your village? Is there air pollution? Are there brownouts? Are there enough jobs? Are people happy? You know what it's like to play SimCity, right? But the game is modeling your decision making as you go through, and it's trying to understand not just do you understand the scientific principles here, but how good is your understanding of systems thinking and the complicated ins and outs of how these things go together. This is another great example. Dan Schwartz creates small game-based assessments that test elements of design thinking, another kind of higher order skill. Finally, when I think about my daughter, I would really like her to live in a future of tests that is helping, not harming, her learning and also her human flourishing, and helping sort of every student in the country do the same thing. So that's it. Can I take a few questions? Okay. Yes?
So, I just started college
Yeah. Yeah.
How would you recommend fixing that? I know MIT has this matrix.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I know the problem is like, I mean, they take the SAT too, but like,
So about 800 colleges out of 4,000-ish don't use tests or make them or score optional, and that number is growing year by year, and it includes many sort of high-end schools that you may have heard of. And there was a large-scale study that was released last year showing that at score-optional schools, there was no difference in terms of the success of the students of whether they submitted their scores or not, even though the students that did not submit their scores were in higher risk categories in other ways. They were more demographically diverse in different ways. So colleges have the ability to make these decisions without relying on these 4-digit scores, and some of them are choosing to do that. As long as these types of scores are available and they're convenient to use, I mean, there's 2 ways of going about this. We can double down with more sources of data to incorporate and sort of end the monopoly of standardized tests. Or we can say less data and go more holistic and more kind of qualitative driven, and that takes a little bit more work on the part of the sorters, whether that be employers or colleges. And I think there's kind of merit in both paths. What we can't keep doing is taking people's shoe size and pretending like that says something really important about who they're going to be. Yeah.
Going off what he said, I also agree with him. I don't think the SATs can really, I'm actually a senior in high school right now.
Mm-hmm.
I take the SATs in October. And I don't think the SATs is like, it can't boil down my work into 2,400 points. So I already see that. So I really think that they should relook at the SATs and try to make it more better. And I'm wondering if there's like a solution to either replacing the SATs or maybe should I just continue studying for them? Or I don't know.
There are tips in my book for how to beat tests by understanding the flawed ways in which they're constructed. I'm sorry that it won't be out in time for October, but I may put that up on my website. Yes?
Do you have any ideas of how you test for creativity?
Robert Sternberg, who is a pretty eminent psychologist, has created a series of tests, the Rainbow Assessment, Kaleidoscope, and Panorama, and they test what he calls the 4 legs of intelligence: analytic, creative, practical intelligence, and what he calls wisdom, which is a little bit of a blend of empathy and taking the long view. And his creativity, I mean, there's been a number of attempts to test creativity. A lot of it has to do with generating solutions to problems, coming up with, captions for cartoons, or finishing a story that someone's given to you. Sometimes drawing pictures or thinking of what to do with a brick. Like, there's a bunch of different tasks that sort of been normed. And he's had great success with using these types of tests, for example, with Tufts admission, where he worked as a dean of admissions for a while. And what it did was it showed that certain demographic groups that were lower scored in the traditional tests had compensating scores on these other tests. And so it did a long way toward reducing demographic difference in admissions.
Excellent. Actually, we have to wrap it up, but would you be able to stay away a few minutes afterwards?
Sure.
So let's give her a hand. Give Anna a hand for this presentation.